Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you are well, and I welcome you to this RSIS seminar today. When we speak about geopolitics, politics of this region here in the Indo-Pacific, as we call it now, we talk mostly about China and the United States. Of course, luckily for us here in this region, it is not all that binary. And for that very reason, we are very pleased to welcome you to the RSIS webinar called Between Ambition and Ambivalence, Australian Diplomacy in an Era of Strategic Change. Now, we place here in this region great hope on Australia. No pressure there, Caitlin. I guess for a long time, Australia has been a bit reluctant to engage. The mantra in Canberra, correct me if I'm wrong, Caitlin, but I think the mantra in Canberra can be summed up as something like, let us get rich together with China, let our economy bounce off China's growth. And they remain relatively silent on everything else. That's totally understandable. After all, China is Australia's largest trading partner by far. I checked in preparation for this seminar, and the next placed Japan doesn't even come close, less than half, I guess, in total, or something around half from the trade volume with China. Now, lately in the past few years, and especially under the ScoMo administration, this is changing a bit, and Australia is singing arguably a slightly different tune. Canberra is becoming more robust, I guess, towards China. This is probably a consequence of increasing Chinese assertiveness that we see here in this region, but also closer to home to Australia, alleged influence operations, cyber attacks, but also China has been steadily building its influence in what Australia would probably see as its strategic backyard in the South Pacific, just north of Australia. So this translated to stronger high-level rhetoric on China coming out of Canberra, but also deeper involvement with the Quad, participating in this year's Malabar exercises, as we recently learned. But we also learned very recently, in fact, that Australia will no longer be sending Navy ships to the Middle East every year. Australia will withdraw from the ports in the Strait of Hormuz because, as the defense minister said, and I quote her here, Australia faces an increasingly challenging strategic environment closer to home. This is why the Australian Defence Forces are needed here in this region and not elsewhere. So I guess one could say that as far as China is concerned, Australia moved from relatively extreme complacency towards being relatively extremely China conscious in recent years, again, especially under the ScoMo administration. The problem here is that there seems to be a relatively strong military and security bias here in this new perspective on China and this region. This is reflected, and again, please correct me later if I'm wrong here, but this is reflected in a growing defense budget, or at least predicted a growing defense budget, while at the same time cutting quite a bit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, cutting diplomacy, in other words. So to discuss the chance of this diplomacy, possibly against the odds, in the light of what I've just mentioned, we are at RSIS very pleased to have Professor Caitlin Byrne with us today. She's the director of the Griffiths Institute in Brisbane, Australia, and joins us from there. She's also a faculty fellow at the University of Southern California Center for Public Diplomacy, and her research is focused on Australian diplomacy. So, in the light of what I've just said, who better talk to than Caitlin? Before I hand over to you, Prof. Caitlin, a couple of housekeeping announcements. One is, Caitlin will speak for 20, 30 minutes, more or less, and then you can all the while post your questions you may have, which I will then read out, curate if necessary, in the Q&A function. But, here comes the but, Caitlin has also asked me to raise the question, what the people here in this region actually think about Australia's engagement in the region. How do we feel here towards Australia? So if you want to share your thoughts on this, please do so. Indicate that this is not a question, but your sentiment regarding Australia's involvement here in this region. And I will read this out for Caitlin's benefit and all our benefit. So with this, no further ado, Prof. Caitlin, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Frederick. It's really lovely to be here with you. and to be speaking to RSIS. You know, it's known across the region for its research excellence and scholarship. And of course, a number of scholars from Griffith Asia Institute, and you'll see my banner behind me, follow the work of RSIS and always look forward to visiting you in Singapore, albeit it's been a while since we've been able to visit. So hopefully that we'll be able to get some of those things back on track soon. So firstly, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and I appreciate, Frederick, your hosting and moderation of this conversation. And as you mentioned, you know, I'm really looking forward to questions as well as comments, and hearing a little bit about what people across the region are thinking in relation to Australia's diplomatic engagement in the region. And can I also make a bit of a shout out to Dr. Karen Pitak-Domronkit, who actually was someone who put me in touch with RSIS. We had the good fortune of presenting together, maybe it was a year ago, Karen, time is blurring, but we were together at the International Relations Institute in Cambodia, and can I say, another outstanding representative of RSIS who does brilliant work. So again, a real pleasure for me to be here with you. And can I also begin with a slightly Australian protocol, given that I'm here in Brisbane and presenting to you from here. If I could respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting here in Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations peoples, including those who might be joining us today across the widest reaches of this virtual platform. And I don't make that acknowledgement lightly. I think as we face some of the significant contemporary challenges of today's world, there's a place for really thinking about how we integrate traditional wisdom and local knowledge into our problem solving. So they're my brief opening remarks, I guess. And perhaps one more thing I should mention. I come to this presentation probably as a practitioner academic more than anything. I began my career as a diplomat in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as a lawyer nearly 3 decades ago, and have worked across various levels of government in Australia, and both in urban, regional and rural locations, coming only more recently to academia. So I think some of my comments will probably reflect that practitioner background more than anything. And I recognise that you know, I'm looking forward to hearing from both the practitioners and academics who may well be in the audience. But let me then begin. So this topic, looking at Australian diplomacy caught between ambivalence or ambition and ambivalence as it faces up to a contested world, has been something I've been thinking about for a while. And I recently wrote an essay which is going to be included in the Oxford Handbook on Australian Politics that kind of focused on some of these issues, really focused in on Australia's pursuit of place in the world. And it led me to consider some of these forces of change and continuity at play in Australia's foreign policy discourse and the implementation of foreign policy, in particular through diplomatic practice, and looking at the drivers behind this. And I think it's fair to say that Australia's place in the world is one of an evolving orientation, both real and imagined, of what it means to be Australian in this world and in this region. The essay, of course, was written pre-COVID-19, and you know, as these things happen, the compilation itself has been slightly caught up by COVID-19. So as I've been recently going over some of the final proofs and updating, I've really been prompted to revisit some of the ideas I had originally written about, but through this COVID-19 lens, which I think has brought some of the themes into a sharper focus. And what's really struck me has been this constant tension at play, the dual forces within an Australian psyche, ambition on the one hand and ambivalence on the other, both of which really have been sharpened by the COVID outbreak. And these forces work in very different ways, sometimes overlapping, to define the nature, conduct and reach of Australia's outward engagement, in particular within its own region. But at the same time, they reflect inwardly to influence the nation's sense of place and discourse about its place in the world. Over time, I think it's unsurprising that these competing forces have possibly given the impression that Australia's approach to the outside world is gripped by what George Megalogenis calls the repetitive impulses to engage followed by retreat, followed by engage, followed by retreat. But ultimately, looking at past trends, I think we can safely say, at least up until the COVID-19 point, and I think I'm going to forecast that it does extend beyond, that we can safely say ultimately the nation's place-making project has tended towards openness over insularity, engagement over isolation, and activism over passivity. But it's not always even, and it's not always clear. So COVID-19 will be a backdrop for the discussion today. And in a second, I'd like to just talk about what that means. But then I'd really like to talk to this recent call for ambition in the nation's foreign policy. It's certainly a call that has been made in a post-COVID world, but it's not new. And in fact, it was just a few years earlier in 2017, when the Foreign Policy White Paper was launched by the Australian government, that we saw ambition really sort of colour the texture of Australian foreign policy rhetoric. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, where we've seen it before in the past and where we've seen it really play out, particularly this year since the COVID-19 outbreak. But then I'd also like to turn to the other side of the coin and what I've termed signs of ambivalence, noting probably in particular that they relate to the domestic context and to these points of intersection in the way that we think about domestic and foreign. I should note that there's another A word I haven't really talked about all that much, and that's anxiety. And there are many in the Australian foreign policy world. And I'm thinking in particular of one of our leading practitioners, former practitioners, Alan Gyngell, who really suggests that at the end of the day, much of Australian foreign policy discourse and practice is underpinned by this idea of, or notion of anxiety, stemming from a fear of abandonment. And we can talk about that later. I do come to a conclusion that anxiety sits within this picture somewhere, probably somewhere between ambition and ambivalence. I guess, I mentioned before, that I think ultimately we can make a claim that Australian diplomacy, what some might see as pragmatic, hopefully tending towards constructive, maybe even creative, in its many forms, has played a critical, though I would suggest undervalued, increasingly undervalued role in positioning Australia on the regional and global stage. And I think in this post-COVID world, it's really deserving of attention. I'm less convinced about that this claim will win through, but I certainly hope it's the case, and it's something I'd really like to flesh out with you. So let's begin then with this post-COVID or the COVID-19 context. It's worth noting that whilst COVID-19 is really an unprecedented kind of pandemic outbreak, it's not something that was unforeseen or that was off the radar. And from the early 2000s, global public health experts, foreign policy experts, policy makers have been flagging the risks, the global risks in particular associated with disease outbreaks, and that's been heightened through the experience, particularly in this region, of dealing with SARS and H1N1, but also more broadly, we can think about the Ebola context from a couple of years ago. So it may not have been necessarily a foreign policy priority, but it was certainly on the radar. And I mentioned the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper that Australia produced a couple of years ago. Pandemics are identified there as one of the key challenges that Australian policymakers and policymakers more broadly would need to be thinking about. So it's interesting then that when COVID-19 ultimately hit, it hit with the force really of a sledgehammer. The immediate impacts including the closure of international and internal borders, the implementation of mandatory travel quarantines, the overnight breakdown in some cases of supply chains, the lockdown of cities, the pressure for citizens across the world to return to their homelands, the renewed forces of protectionism, all of these things seemed to reverse overnight some of the most visible features of our globalized world. Now, not only that, but COVID-19 globally accelerated many of the negative trends that were already underway prior to the pandemic. It's certainly the case when we think about the systemic competition between the US and the People's Republic of China. And that rivalry has intensified, and we've seen the relationship between China and the US continue to deteriorate. So I think all of COVID-19 has certainly had that amplifying effect across the board. And it's brought certain pressures to bear on diplomatic practice, of course, and many of these are well articulated. First and foremost, and most visibly, we know that the practice of diplomacy has had to change really quickly to go from a practice which is steeped in personal bonds, more often than not, whether behind closed doors or in public, to taking place in the virtual world. And that's really changed things quite dramatically in terms of how we maintain and build relationships, how we read cues around the line, how we get together in summits, and how we actually deliver on some of those really important conversations that would happen in the corridor, around the water bubbler, at the coffee table, rather than just around the big diplomatic table. So it's brought a whole lot of new challenges to bear, even though we've seen, the diplomatic world shift reasonably well. The G20, the UN General Assembly, ASEAN, all working in virtual formats today. But nonetheless, it brings some real pressures to the way that we continue to engage in the diplomatic circuit. For Australia, though, these pressures, I think, are amplified. Australia, as a big island nation, tends to look outwardly regardless for both its security and its prosperity. Its diplomatic activity is intensely active, although its reach may not be as strong as many other OECD or even G20 nations. It is a nation that tends to look and act outwardly. Even when you think about Australian travellers, and Australians per capita are seen to be some of the most globally mobile people in the world, this idea that travel has come to a grinding halt, that the flow of students and goods and services has really shifted. All of these have hit very, very hard for the Australian nation. And when we think about diplomatic practice, Frances Adamson, the current Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, notes that 80% of DFAT staff were immediately refocused into a COVID-oriented task force, so dealing with the issues to emerge out of COVID. Now, when you've got an institution that is already reasonably thin on the ground, that's a big ask. At the same time, a number of staff were brought home from all posts across the world, leaving skeleton staffs in place in many places, with those then taking on the mammoth task of returning home, some 27,500 Australian travellers in a matter of weeks. So the whole kind of program of activity has really had to shift over the last few months. So that's an example of where those pressures have really been borne out. At the same time, those broader pressures of a contested region, of growing rivalry between the US and China, and of a deteriorating relationship with China, all add to the pressures at play, both at home in the Ministry and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and at posts right across the region. A lot of these issues were teased out in a recent publication put together by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It's called After COVID 2, which sets out a broad agenda for Australian foreign policy and diplomacy in the post-COVID world, and notes that, despite the scale and forward impact of the crisis, there's also an opportunity to wield influence for good. So we have to be careful not to be caught up just dealing with the impact of crisis and look for those opportunities to wield influence. Michael Shoebridge and Lisa Sharland make the point that Australia must think big to take up those opportunities. It's not simply a matter of accelerating or continuing current policies, but it's actually, nor is it a matter of waiting for others to define the post-COVID agenda for us, because everyone is groping for ideas. But in fact, we need to see ambition brought to bear, not just by Australian leaders and policymakers, but also right across the business, academic and civil society communities. It is an enormous task, but an essential task given what's at stake. So there is this new call for ambition in Australian foreign policy and diplomacy. And as you mentioned, Frederick, earlier on, Australia's not necessarily been known for its ambition in this space. And that was certainly true of the years post-Federation, even right through the first half of the 20th century and potentially in the decades to follow. Australia might have been seen as anything but ambitious in its foreign policy. And yet ambition does seem to be the hallmark of a more contemporary approach. I might add here that it has tended, if you look across different political divides, it has tended to sit more prominently with a Labor tradition, where there's been greater weight brought to bear on multilateral cooperation, particularly through the United Nations and other international bodies, and a desire to engage much more closely within our own region. We've seen it in the 1980s and 90s under the Hawke-Keating years of economic reform, and in the turn towards engaging with regional architecture of the Asia-Pacific and looking to the United Nations and playing an active role in the United Nations. And we also saw it again in the early years of the 2000s under the leadership of Kevin Rudd, where engagement in the G20, the launch of a campaign to sit on the UN Security Council took place, and there were early ambitions to establish an Asia-Pacific community. All of those, alongside other policy agendas, including the reinvigoration of nuclear disarmament, as well as ambitious approaches to climate change, were all bundled into a Rudd approach to foreign policy and to pursuit of place, both in the region and on the global stage. Now, those kind of examples tend to sit in contrast with conservative political leadership in this country, which has tended to emphasise reliance on deep bilateral relationships, particularly with allies, or as former Prime Minister Robert Menzies would have said, a focus on great and powerful friends. And so that's why it's quite striking that we might actually characterise more recent years under a Conservative government as being more ambitious. But I think it's fair to say, if you look at the foreign policy white paper that was delivered by the Conservative government under former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, we can see ambition, clearly at play. Firstly, by casting Australia as a regional power with global interests, a real shift from the language of being a self-declared middle power, for example. But not only that, the white paper pushes the idea of ambition across a range of agendas. The word itself is mentioned, for those that like to know how many times a word is mentioned 7 times, more than the word diplomacy, in fact, across the whole document. Some of those references are reasonably generic. For example, a broad reference to reflecting on the opportunities and uncertainties of a contested world. The foreign policy white paper talks about raising levels of activity and ambition in the delivery of Australia's foreign policy. It also notes that at a time of challenge, and I note this is pre-COVID, at a time of challenge, we could choose to narrow our global vision and ambition, but such an approach would not serve Australia's long-term interests, and nor would it align to our values. More specifically, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, the document makes specific reference suggesting that the Australian government will lift its ambition in its engagement with major Indo-Pacific democracies, working bilaterally and through small groups. Not a specific reference to the Quad, but certainly allows that platform to emerge to promote and protect a shared vision for the region. It also talks about ambition in relation to Australia's relationship with China, noting that the potential for friction will arise, particularly when you see different interests, values, political and legal systems at play, but talks about the need for regular and substantive engagement with China at very senior levels as being essential for achieving our ambitions for that relationship. And finally, on the Pacific, that Australia will engage with the Pacific with greater intensity and ambition. So have we delivered on that ambition, I think is a fair question to ask. Certainly, if you were to look at the early days of the implementation of that foreign policy white paper, you could see examples where that ambition was borne out in the implementation phase. Not only did Australia complete under former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop a very highly visible and successful term on the UN Security Council, it hosted the G20, successfully campaigned again to be a part of the Human Rights Council, and launched another bid for the UN Security Council. The language of the Indo-Pacific as well was not just supported, but deeply embedded in foreign policy discourse and in security circles. Again, giving a platform for reinvigorating Australia's engagement with the Quad, particularly at that stage as a consultative platform for senior officials, but we've seen that more recently lifted to foreign minister level. And under current Prime Minister Morrison and Foreign Minister Payne, that ambition continues to be borne out, even through the COVID-19 timeframe. So Scott Morrison has engaged in virtual summits with regional leaders from Modi to Shinzo Abe to engaging with the G20 and others. Foreign Minister Payne has conducted, according to DFAT Secretary Frances Adamson, some 50 to 60 virtual bilateral meetings with her counterparts. She's taken part in a 2+2 meeting with the US, with counterparts in the US, and recently flew to Japan for that second Quad Foreign Ministers meeting, and along the way met up with counterparts in Japan, but also in Singapore on the way home. So we've seen that activity continue, albeit not to the extent of some other nations, but certainly that level of activity continued in a very deliberate kind of way. In terms of multilateralism, the story doesn't end there either. And I think despite some references that worried some of us who are focused a little more on global internationalism, some early references from Prime Minister Morrison about the problematic impacts of negative globalism, we've actually seen a re-emphasis, indeed advocacy, for Australia maintaining and continuing its multilateral commitments, particularly through COVID and particularly in very visible ways, for example, through the World Health Assembly. Speaking in June at the National Security College, Payne made the point that COVID-19, a shared crisis, is a reminder that many problems are best solved, or indeed can only be solved, through cooperation. And she then went on to talk about Australia's engagement in the multilateral system and re-energising that commitment, although it certainly is qualified in a way, working through, for example, institutions that are seen to be fit for purpose, relevant, contemporary, accountable to member states, free from undue influence, and with an appropriately strong focus on the Indo-Pacific. There is, of course, wider recognition that international engagement doesn't just sit within DFAT, but sits within government agencies well beyond the foreign policy realm. Frederick, you mentioned the budget increase to the Department of Defence. We have seen a significant increase of 270 million going to defence. But what's also interesting at the same time is that the 2017 Defence White Paper actually for the very first time articulates international engagement as part of Defence's core business, particularly looking at our near neighbourhood. So that includes things like defence diplomacy. And then I should note that, again, the Foreign Policy White Paper takes the remit of diplomacy and extends it even more widely, not just to the federal government, but talks about the need to engage government at all tiers, state and local, as well as business representatives, civil society representatives, sporting organisations, for example, students even, in Australia's foreign policy project, all under the banner of soft power. In terms of minilateralism, of course, the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting was an important moment for Marise Payne. Her reference in that meeting to the Quad really talked about it as an important diplomatic network with a positive agenda to support shared interests in maintaining the primacy of rules, individual rights and international law, as well as a platform for building better relationships with nations across ASEAN while stepping up efforts in the Pacific. So there are some of the areas, and there will be more, there are some of the areas where I see ambition at play. And I think we can fairly confidently see it panning out. So where is the ambivalence? And here, you know, I think, again, I look more inwardly, perhaps, at the Australian domestic context for thinking about this idea of ambivalence. Australia is a big island continent. We don't necessarily rub shoulders frequently with others. You know, we are surrounded by vast waters. And I think that potentially is where certainly some of this ambivalence and potentially that anxiety comes from. It's always been an issue. And we've seen the significance of the domestic heightened from time to time, bringing with it a fear of the outside world and a diffidence for difference. And I think there's some worrying trends that we can see at play at the moment. I would suggest there are a couple of areas where we're seeing this at the moment. One, and I was recently involved in writing a paper looking at the state of play for Australia's language and cultural studies, for example, with particular reference to Asian language and cultural studies. It's an area that we've seen, you know, cycles of conversation. We've seen various policy discussions and even policy instruments looking at ways to boost the average Australian's engagement with language and cultural studies, particularly relevant to our near neighbourhood. But we've seen declines in uptake and interest. And, you know, that's, I think, a real issue. It's very telling for the way that Australians are going to be able to understand the environment that they're in, and not just, you know, for students of international relations or policymakers, but importantly also for business. And when you are faced with a situation where something like, you know, 85+% of Australian businesses are not engaged in this region, that's potentially a real problem when you look at the kind of economic dynamics of the region going forward. So that's one area. Another area relates to public attitudes more broadly. And I think this anxiety about the outside world has been amplified through a COVID-19 experience. And we've seen that feed into media discourse about our own region. In some cases, a particularly binary media discourse about, in particular, China. But we've also seen this feed into the kind of architecture that we have in our nation for dealing with the outside world, an architecture that has seen the enlargement of our national security institutions, not just defence, but also home affairs, into a mega department. By contrast, we've seen DFAT dwarfed and somewhat diminished in those same, by scale. At the moment, there's no real natural constituency that is supportive of Australian foreign policy and diplomatic efforts, particularly in the region. And that's always borne out at budget time. And we recently had a new budget delivered that did deliver some pockets of money to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But overall, a downward trajectory in terms of the financial support for the architecture and instruments of diplomacy has been maintained. So I think there's some of the areas where we've seen ambivalence at play. Another area I would suggest is in the soft power sphere. It's an area I'm particularly interested in. I think there was a moment of potential when former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop announced a soft power review in 2018, an opportunity for a national conversation about how Australia articulated its soft power assets and leveraged those more broadly in the world. And we've really not seen that review taken any further. So, and that I think is an opportunity missed for Australia in its own region and advancing its diplomatic project in the region. So there are certainly tensions at play. I don't necessarily think that either ambition or ambivalence are going to win out one over the other, nor do I think we should necessarily preference one over the other. I think it's more about a sophisticated discourse of how we balance our ambition with the realities, certainly the domestic realities of our situation and our understanding of the region. How can we avoid the ambition that can lead to overreach or offend others? But equally, how can we minimize the kind of ambition that tends to cloud our judgment of the region and obscures the importance of diplomacy, and in particular the importance of diplomacy in handling very difficult relationships. I think we have to come to terms with the ambivalence of the way that we manage our relationship with the United States, and depending on the outcome in early November, we have to think really carefully about that relationship. And we've been fairly complacent, I think, in accepting the centrality of Australia, the Australian alliance with the US. I think that alliance is absolutely important. It's not going anywhere, but perhaps we need to recalibrate the way that we engage with the US and the way that we implement various aspects of that alliance. We need to overcome certain elements of ambivalence in our relationship with China, but equally ambivalence in the way that we reach out more broadly across our near neighbourhood in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. Perhaps it is true that both of these elements of the national psyche are underpinned by a deeper, fundamental notion of anxiety. It's certainly been an enduring characteristic of Australia's foreign policy discourse and thinking that leads us to think less about our position of power in the world, but more, as Michael Wesley would suggest, approach the world from a position of powerlessness. So I think ultimately the challenge for us is to find some kind of balance, to be able to have more sensible discourse about our foreign policy approach to our region and the globe, to balance the kind of discourses that we're having in our domestic society, to lift our ambition and balance our ambivalence. And I might leave it there and look at, and happy to head to the questions now, Frederick.
Wow, yeah, thank you very much, Caitlin. That was a brilliant summary encapsulation of the ambivalence and ambition dichotomy. But I wonder, the questions are coming in hard and fast, and I will surely get to it in a minute. We still have plenty of time. Caitlin has also indicated she's willing to stick around slightly longer than we indicated. If it should become necessary. So I will abuse my privilege here as having my microphone on, of delving a bit deeper into what you said about the third A, the anxiety. So you spoke a lot about the ambivalence and the ambition, but I wonder here, and perhaps that's the realist in me, right? You gave us a very psychological, social constructivist even perspective of Australian foreign policy. And I truly, really appreciate it. And maybe it's a realist here in me asking the question whether this ambition is much more a reaction to anxiety. So whether this ambition is not really genuinely locally driven ambition towards the region, but rather a reaction to externally imposed anxiety. And I'm speaking here very specifically about China, of course, like the role China is carving out for itself in the region. And whether Australia perhaps realizes, oh my God, if we are completely passive here, we will not only annoy our very important alliance partners, but we will perhaps also lose some strategic space. And we will perhaps be maneuvered into a situation where we would really have to make tough choices. Australia's Hugh White, always controversial, of course, but he even suggested that Australia may have to go nuclear at some point, right? So certainly an extreme reaction, but nonetheless, kind of reflective of the third A you mentioned, the anxiety. Perhaps you have some thoughts on this before I go on to
Absolutely, and it's a great question, Frederick, and it's really interesting because when he delivered the keynote at the 2017 Shangri-La Dialogue, Malcolm Turnbull talked about Australia's ambition, ambition born of confidence, and he then went on to talk about a vision for the Indo-Pacific that he saw emerging from this ambition born of confidence that Australia could, play an active role in shaping. But actually, I think you're absolutely, I think at the heart of it, if we take a very healthy, realist look at the world within which we are operating, that ultimately it is anxiety at the core of much of what is happening at the moment, or at much of Australia's kind of approach to the world. But what I would say is that regardless of whether it comes from a sense of confidence or a sense of anxiety or ambivalence at play as well, that what the key thing to come through is this idea of agency, this idea that we have to play an active role in shaping the region. And I think that, going back to your earlier comments before, that's significantly different from the kind of rhetoric we might have seen Australia engage in times past. This idea of being very active, of shaping the rules at play, of shaping the kind of order we want to see, that active agency is quite clear. But I suspect you're right. I suspect it's born out of anxiety rather than confidence. Confidence is a much more positive way of putting it when you're speaking in particular at the Shangri-La Dialogue, but that would be how I'd see it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I move on here to the first question that comes from Professor Alan Chong, who happens to be my boss, and with this the head of the Center of Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS. And he thanks you for your great presentation, but he also asks you, do you foresee Australia taking a leaf from China's pandemic recovery diplomacy, as he calls it, in other words, mask diplomacy, restoring tourists and business passengers traffic, reciprocal green lanes and air travel, exporting all sorts of essential consumer goods and so forth. So do you foresee Australia doing this too? And then he has a somehow related question, I guess, that also relates to Australia's engagement with developing countries. He's referring to the Step Up program. I think it's called the Pacific Step Up, which is relatively new, right? A couple of years. Will Australia's Step Up program for the South Pacific actively offer small states a real alternative to Beijing's Belt and Road extension? And this can be extended to Indonesia, for example, too.
Yeah.
I'll leave you with those two.
Wow, they're not small questions, are they, Prof? Thank you. They're great questions, though. And I think what we are seeing certainly is considered thought about how to potentially be more creative in diplomatic activity and not necessarily directly related to mask diplomacy, but this is where I think the soft power idea does come through, and in particular thinking about the hard edge of soft power. So the kind of capacity building, development assistance approaches that might be taken under the banner of soft power, but really to build influence, to cultivate influence in the region. And I think most certainly the Pacific Step Up is at the core of that. And Australia has absolutely made it clear, not just in the Foreign Policy White Paper, but as you mentioned earlier, Frederick, in the Defence Strategic Update, that Australia is looking much more closer to home in its near region. The Pacific is absolutely central to that. I think we have to remember we're not the only ones thinking about our influence in the Pacific, and certainly, now I'll get all these names wrong, but New Zealand has its own Pacific, perhaps it's the Pacific Uplift or Elevate. We're seeing all sorts of words, Elevate, Uplift, Step Up, come into play in relation to the Pacific, and this real concern that this is where influence is increasingly contested. which will drive different forms of diplomatic engagement, less traditional forms of diplomatic engagement as well. So another one that will play into that will be sport, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I am quite a fan of sports diplomacy. I must admit, I was involved in some of the work behind the Australian sports diplomacy strategy, which does look at sport. And I think it's looking at unconventional vehicles for diplomatic engagement, for building understanding. But we have to be, I think, very realistic in understanding that there is often a hard edge. These are not altruistic policies. There is a potentially hard edge to influence building in its various forms.
Fantastic, thank you. Then we have here a question coming from Kogila Balakrishnan, Dr. Kogila Balakrishnan. I believe she's with the University of Warwick, and she thinks that there seems to be an increasing diverging interests between economic dependency and political foreign policy distancing with China. How does Australia see itself managing this complex contradiction, I guess? So she's also asking, will Australia review this position in the future to reduce the economic interdependence that is part of this contradiction?
I think this is such an important question, and I won't have an answer at all. But I think what we can say is this is where diplomacy, is absolutely critically important. And diplomacy across the many policy spheres, the many policy domains that the Australia-China relationship touches, and indeed it touches every policy domain. Frederick, you mentioned at the very beginning just the significance of the economic relationship. You're absolutely right. China is Australia's #1 trading partner, as it is for many nations across the region and indeed the globe. But when you look at subsequent trading partners, China outstrips, the top 3 or 4 by a long way. So I think we have to be very realistic that Australia's future involves a relationship with China and an economic relationship with China. But it is increasingly difficult to play out the many dimensions of this relationship. That is where diplomacy comes into play. Diplomacy is not about, working through easy relationships. It's about the difficult relationships. It's about looking at how we minimize tensions. It might be that we have to play a role with greater emphasis on our quiet diplomacy. We know at the moment, for example, that connections at the most senior levels are not good. So we have to look at other opportunities to be connected and to work through difficulties with China and look for those points of common ground, the areas for cooperation. It is hard. There's absolutely no doubting that, but they are there. And I think in terms of looking at the challenges that the region itself faces, and I'm thinking here of the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whichever way you'd like to talk about it, and challenges like infrastructure. I don't know that we can necessarily look to a future where China doesn't play a role in infrastructure in the region. We can't look to a future where China isn't engaged in climate action. So I think this is a vexing issue. There's no one size fits all formula. And whilst I do argue that Australia's diplomatic capacity, much as the Lowy Institute said about 10 years ago, has been thinned out and hollowed out, stretched thin and hollowed out, I should say. I think we've got very good diplomats. And for that, it's a good thing. They're facing these difficult issues. But I think we've got to think creatively. And we certainly do not want to, in my view, look to a future where we are excluding China from very important conversations.
No, I completely agree. I also find that the Lowy Institute seems to be very pushing on this. They pretty much every paper and podcast they produce, they lament the decreasing or at least insufficient funding for Australian diplomacy. And this really seems to be, especially the director, seems to be a very issue very close to his heart.
Yes.
And sorry, yeah.
No, well, I was going to say, if you look at the diplomacy index that Alex Oliver has put together, and Alex, I think, is one of the key advocates as well for diplomacy, Australia's diplomatic capabilities. I think that it's a good thing we have the Lowy Institute on this case, because they're very visibly demonstrating that Australia is lagging in this space.
And so influential too. Okay, so but the situation you just described is something I feel reminded of course, when I think of all regional powers, not only regional powers, actually of Europe as well. They have the same issues, right? They're all caught between this contradiction of being on the one hand, not necessarily dependent on China, but very, very economically tied to China. But then on the other side, there is domestic pressure, of course, in many countries regarding recalibration of the relation to China. But there's also, of course, outside pressure, mostly emerging from out of the United States, to take a tougher stance on China. And how do you navigate this? It's all fine and nice to say from the United States, who are actually a lot more self-sufficient and function a lot more autonomously, I guess, from other countries here in this region and also in Europe. But this pressure is really there, not only on Australia, it's really there on all, I guess, regional powers as well as European powers.
And I think that's a really important point, Frederick, in terms of that ambivalence. We've got to be able to, just as we manage the relationship with China, we've got to be able to manage that relationship with the US and navigate where in fact, we have to be very conscious of our interests in this region, which may be different from the US's interests as a great power. And I think that's something that we need to pay more attention to. The other thing I would suggest that complicates the situation is that Australia has a really significant number of Chinese diaspora that live here. I won't even put a number on it because I'll probably get it wrong. But we have very deep and strong people-to-people ties, and much of that comes from our Chinese communities here. And I think they play into this debate as well, and thinking about, and it's not, again, it's very complex, but how we manage the expectations within a very multicultural, diverse domestic public is also a real challenge.
Thank you. Haridas, he's one of our former postgraduate students here from Singapore, and he's sharing his perspective per your request on Australia. And he says that Australia has not sufficiently engaged the key powers in ASEAN with regard to the China threat, quote unquote, in the South China Sea. So it would seem that Australia continues to regard itself as an outsider, and an outsider that would like to keep a low profile. So that's his perspective on Australia, is in particular coming from the ASEAN region, from an ASEAN country. He's also then connecting this to a question that is not really connected, I guess, but it's a question that is on his mind that asks whether the Australia's engagement with the Quad would possibly link to a development to the five-power defense arrangement. I guess he means whether Australia is going to network its different and connect its different security networks,
I think that's a great question, and one of the things I would say that is coming through, if you were to listen to people like Richard Maud, former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and indeed chief author of the Foreign Policy White Paper, as well as Francis Adamson, the impression you get is that the Quad is important, but it's certainly not the only platform that Australia is looking at. It's certainly not the only mini-lateral kind of platform. But in fact, and this is again a diplomatic challenge for Australia, there is this new emphasis on building and thickening networks and alignments right across the region. And I think that there has been an increased push to engage more closely with all member nations of ASEAN. Again, that requires capacity and resources, and I think there's real opportunity to thicken those relationships. But that's been a focus over the last couple of years. It does come through the Foreign Policy White Paper, and I think we will see things like the five-power defence agreement, play into this very textured, thick network of relationships.
Thank you. There's a question here that I find very, very interesting from Sunil Pillai. He's asking how much of the foreign policy ambitions you describe are actually supported by the Australian public. I find this incredibly intriguing, a question I have myself. Do you have any data on this, or do you have any?
It's really hard. It's hard to measure, but let's say this. Generally speaking, when you have a national election, foreign policy issues do not rate on the agenda. So they're not. It's not necessarily something that wins votes. And where we can see some of the issues play out, again, we can give a shout out to the Lowy Institute. The Lowy Institute poll of Australian perceptions of Australia's place in the world does highlight where Australians see or place priority on certain issues. And one of the things we have seen, so while ambition across the foreign policy agenda might be too broad a brush to be thinking about, we do see Australians in general supporting certain ambitions. Climate change, I should note, has risen to the top of the list of things, foreign policy issues Australians are worried about. Now that's an issue where we haven't necessarily seen government action match the kind of public sentiment. So a little bit of a disconnect there, which is interesting. At the same time, you know, in that same poll, we've also seen levels of trust of the outside world declining, trust in Australia's relationship with China declining, trust in Australia's relationship with the US under Trump declining. So look, I think it's certainly not a vote winner. It doesn't make headlines during an election, but increasingly Australians are aware of the big issues in their region. Support is a big word, and I think when you get to debates about where public money goes, support for our diplomacy, our diplomatic capability tends to wane. And again, that's where that domestic constituency for our diplomatic assets is often missing.
Okay, I just want to remind our audience that we have come to the end of the actual schedule time. So please feel free to drop off, of course, if you have other engagements. If not, please join us for a little extension to the seminar with Caitlin's prior agreement. We still have quite a number of very interesting questions, and I really do not want to miss any of those. The next one is from Prof. Jikon Lai. He is here with us here in Singapore, an expert on IPE matters, but also generally Indo-Pacific. And he, interestingly, is here with us in Singapore, but he's home to Melbourne. So great interest in Australia, of course. And he is putting up a very long question. He sees that the Australia's current relationship with China is very toxic, possibly as a result of failure in diplomacy. As with the United States in the past, any one country's relationship with China is arguably the key relationship in today's international system. So his question is, if Australia is struggling to manage its relationship with the one actor that most matters in today's world, the one actor that has influence and interest in almost all spheres of the international system, does a list of achievements that you have enumerated really matter? And what does it say about Australian diplomacy?
Well, Prof, great question.
Whether you agree to his.
Maybe I'm a little more sanguine about the language, and I would suggest the relationship is certainly at its lowest ebb. You might go as far as saying it's toxic, but I think there are avenues where there are opportunities still for cooperation. They're narrow, there's no question, and there is no question that this is one of the key issues on the diplomatic agenda. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a failure of diplomacy, and my sense is it's not so much of an absolute or a zero-sum game. I think it's certainly something we've got to work on. I would suggest that where those points of failure have been, or where those low ebbs have been triggered, has been through a response to a domestic audience rather than working through the diplomatic relationship. And I think that's been problematic. I think we've possibly relied too much on very overt statements intended primarily, again, it would seem, for domestic audiences rather than that quiet diplomacy. So look, I wouldn't like to say it's a failure. I think there have certainly been lessons learned, and I hope that we're able to see those play out. I don't necessarily think either that, you know, you ignore the vast array of other relationships. And I think in particular, building and continuing deep relationships with Japan, Indonesia, India, these are absolutely critical to balancing and building support and strategic heft in multilateral institutions, not just through a bilateral sphere. I think we can learn a lot from other actors in the region, Japan, Korea, Indonesia as well as Singapore. So I think we shouldn't be ignoring those other relationships. And I think also we've got to continue to maintain an eye on the relationship with the US that we sometimes take for granted, that we understand. And I think there are questions around just how well we understand each other at times. So I think that was a roundabout answer, Prof. I hope that I hope we got there in the end. And I hope, did you mention, Frederick, that he's in Melbourne at the moment?
Oh, he's in Singapore at the moment. But
Singapore at the moment.
Yeah, Melbourne.
I was going to say, if you were in Melbourne at the moment, you'd be feeling relieved to have come out of lockdown.
Okay, so here's a question from Ambassador Retired, Annemarie Schleich, who hails from my home country, a former diplomat, now retired diplomat from Germany. She is asking, she finds that Australia has not committed substantially more resources to development assistance in Pacific Island countries, whereas China has heavily committed there. And if she's wondering whether this means that the Pacific step up we already spoke about earlier in the Pacific is too little, too late competition for influence in this region.
Really good question again. Thank you. The step up, there are certainly those that would suggest the step up was too little, too late. But I think it's important to recognise that Australia is one of the biggest or the biggest donor of development assistance in the Pacific region and well ahead of China, and has been for some time. But absolutely, I think we dropped the ball at different phases in Australia's relationship. Just going back to the Kevin Rudd timeframe, where we did see a very ambitious agenda laid out by Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, the Pacific again was included in that, and a real move to building relationships. Now, of course, you might remember there was a fair bit of political turmoil that came from the Rudd years subsequently right through to only recently. And I think that the Pacific, our relationships in the Pacific potentially have suffered over time. I think we've also fallen into a bit of a trap of not necessarily listening to what it is the Pacific is after or seeking in its relationship. So it potentially has been a little lopsided. But I would say that some of that is also changing, and that there is greater attention to understanding the Pacific experience. New Zealand probably does that far better and has done for far longer. But I think that there is an increasingly much more openness to thinking about how the Pacific is experiencing various issues at the moment, and how policy can be refined to deliver on those needs and expectations and interests. And I think increasingly also recognition that Pacific Island nations will do what Pacific Island nations will want to do, what they see as being in their interests. Whereas perhaps we've expected that they might fall into the slipstream of Australian interests.
Slightly taken.
Without question.
Yeah. I wonder, I would presume, just as a little add-on, that climate change is probably the number one topic, right? They will, I remember speaking to several representatives from Pacific Islands, and they all told me in Singapore 2 years ago, and they all told me that climate change is their number one concern, and pretty much nothing else really matters. So
absolutely. And the Boy Declaration puts climate change and human security at the forefront of Pacific Island interests. I think also the blue narrative has galvanized the Pacific Island nations in a way where they are seeking to advance collective interests, and they're doing it, very cleverly on the international stage through multilateral fora. So I think that's important. And I think that climate change issue is really problematic for Australia's engagement in the Pacific as well.
We have another question from Henry Chana. He is posing two questions, but I believe the second question you've actually already answered in your presentation. So I would like to focus on the first one. The China-US rivalry, of course, he's also identifying this as a defining geopolitical agenda for a long time. The question is, what role, a very interesting question, what role Australia like China to play in this part? From the other one.
Again, excellent question, and something I think that is a gap when we talk about Australian foreign policy. And in fact, you will see recent calls for this conversation to happen. I think there has been a critique of the way that Australia has approached its China relationship as being a series of opinions. And we do tend to lurch from issue to issue rather than taking that step back. I think it was Paul Kelly, a commentator in The Australian, who recently said, we really actually have to define how we see this relationship and start with the end point in mind and work our way back. I don't know that we've actually got to that point or that it's been articulated in that way yet. And I think that's something that really needs to be driving the foreign policy discussion across all those different domains. Again, you know, a comprehensive kind of China strategy that actually speaks to, and I mentioned the foreign policy white paper talks about a relationship of comprehensive engagement, a relationship that is built on ambition. But what it doesn't do, and where it falls short, is then telling us what that relationship looks like. So I think that's a gap that certainly needs to be addressed.
We have another question here from anonymous source asking whether, is there any risk at the written word, I guess, as in quite policy, that the written word has a higher ambition than the outcome than what the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade can actually deliver?
Well, yeah. Any policy is really only as good as its implementation, isn't it? So actually having the capability to implement, and that's where, you know, many of us would suggest that the capability is somewhat thin on the ground. It's very good where it is, but that it could be absolutely boosted. You know, and I did mention the budget earlier. I think DFAT was given an extra $25 million to implement the foreign relations legislation that looks at and sort of scrutinizes all of the different international engagements that are advanced by state governments or provincial governments, as well as institutions like universities. Now, I and others would suggest that doesn't necessarily enhance Australia's diplomatic capacity. That is an administrative burden that's going to be quite problematic to implement. So I think it's a matter of matching our words with the right capabilities and thinking about what implementation looks like. And again, I think they're parts of the story that potentially remain disconnected.
Okay, we're coming towards the end with the final question coming from Phil Dakila from NUS here in Singapore. Has the new Colombo plan, I think it's a program for university students, right? Knowledge about this region. Has the new Colombo plan for Australia's engagement with Asia, particularly in terms of Asian language and cultural studies?
Yes, Phil, great question. And yes, it has. It's certainly been a boost because the new Colombo plan is basically a reverse Colombo plan, which the Colombo plan saw scholars come to Australia. The new Colombo plan is about outbound student mobility. It hasn't necessarily achieved the grand vision of ensuring that study study living and working in Asia would become a rite of passage for all young Australians. It hasn't necessarily delivered that, but it has certainly lifted the engagement of young students across the Asia-Pacific region. I think it's been really positive in building institutional connections as well, and building connections with industry, because there is a work component to that as well. It needs to be secured. It needs greater funding. It would be fabulous to see that rolled out to far more students. And I've written a little bit about, you know, some of the issues surrounding the new Colombo plan, where it focuses on elite students. You know, it doesn't necessarily deliver on all of its promises, but I tell you what, it's an initiative that we needed, and we need to keep going and expand on.
Thank you very much. On this very positive note, I would like to end our webinar here today. Kathleen, I thank you very much for staying even well and beyond what we had agreed to on the schedule. I know it's already quite late where you are. I certainly take away from this seminar a lot. I take away that my very simple activity of counting ships doesn't get me very far, and that you have added a lot of intellectual edge to the discussion that I'm having here quite often when I talk about Australia. I spend quite a bit of time in Australia, and I love Australian soft power. And what I like most about Australia is wine, Australian wine. And with this, I will end here, because it's not only late evening where you are, but early evening where we are. And I will open an Australian wine and toast to you virtually. Unfortunately, we can't do this here in person, but I do it virtually. And I look forward to seeing you at some point here in Singapore. On behalf of RSIS, on behalf of all our audience, I thank you very much for your time this late evening, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you to everyone at RSIS. I will toast you back and look forward to you visiting Griffith Asia Institute at some stage, and your colleagues. So please keep us in mind, and thanks so much for this evening. It's been great. Cheers.